So I wish this song didn't resonate so much across this country, but Alicia Keys did a beautiful job helping to center us in this conversation today, especially acknowledging the loss of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, the shootings that have just occurred in California, another school shooting in Iowa. This is the reality that we live in. And we're so grateful to all of you for being here with us today, for joining us in this conversation, and for participating in what is our 11th chapter discussion, focused on Professor Chris Henning's book, Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Those of you who've been with us know that we've been joined by young people, scholars, advocates, impacted families, talking about how this nation criminalizes Black, Latino, Native, Indigenous, and other children, and the impact of that and what we can do about it. How do we stop this criminalization? And today's conversation is critically important for all of us to really focus on the harms this causes to families. And we couldn't be more delighted to have the expertise and time of Jeannette Bocanegra, Professor Dorothy Roberts, and Professor Chris Henning in this conversation. We are excited to learn from them and to engage in this dialogue and to take, as we have each month, from their expertise and bring it forward in the advocacy that we each do with and on behalf of young people and their families. So we're going to start this program, as we do with each of them, with brief introductions. We'll put full bios of our esteemed panelists in the chat. And then I'll ask each of the panelists why this conversation matters so much to them, why focusing on chapter 11 and the harms that causes the criminal and family policing system causes to families is so important for today. So I'll start with our Professor Chris Henning, who wrote Rage of Innocence. As we hope all of you know by now, Chris is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice and Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown. Chris has represented young people in DC Superior Court for more than 3 decades, and she has inspired and taught an untold number of youth advocates and created many youth defenders across the country. Chris trains a wide variety of advocates and decision makers on the role of race and racism in legal decision making. She is the proud author of Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Thank you so much for being with us, Chris. We are delighted to have Jeannette Bocanegra with us today. Jeannette joins us as the Executive Director of Justice for Families, and she's also the Community Corrections for Youth Director of Family Engagement. She joined the Community Corrections for Youth in 2010 as the lead researcher on participatory action research project that mobilized family members of incarcerated youth. She is a dedicated grandmother of 2, mother of 6, and longtime resident of the South Bronx. She joins us today from Puerto Rico, and she has served as a speaker and a consultant for many high-profile youth justice initiatives, including the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and she's the recipient of numerous awards, one in 2015 of the Child Welfare Organizing Project's Courageous Activist Award. Jeannette, we're so happy to have you with us and are so grateful for all the work that you do to mobilize families and communities in this effort to decriminalize young people. And of course, we're delighted to have with us Professor Dorothy Roberts. Professor Roberts is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor and the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossell Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Roberts is an internationally acclaimed scholar, activist, social critic, and she's written and lectured extensively on the interplay of gender, race, and the legal system concerning reproductive bioethics, child welfare, and race. We're so delighted to have her in conversation today about her latest book, Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families, and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. In this book, she exposes the foundational racism of the family policing system, what most of you on this webinar call the child welfare system, and the call for its abolition. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us in this dialogue today. I'm now going to ask you to give that 60-second response. Why is this conversation we're having today about Chapter 11, how Black families are impacted by the criminalization of Black youth? Why is it so important to you? We'll start with Professor Chris Henning.
So, Marianne, as you all know, I've been representing children in juvenile courts for the last 26 years. And I have to say that I have seen how every single arrest, every prosecution, every detention of a child impacts not only the child, but the entire family, their parents, grandparents, their siblings, their aunts, their uncles, and all of their significant others. And I really just don't think that we give that enough weight or attention. And I don't think we factor in the collateral impacts on families. It's more than collateral, the immediate impacts on families as one of the costs in our responses in the juvenile legal system. And so for me, this is an incredibly important conversation.
Thanks so much, Kristin. Really honing in on families. Jeannette Bocanegra, I'll ask you the same question. Why is this topic, how Black families are impacted by the criminalization of Black youth, so important to you?
It hit home in 2010. I worked on the research project with Justice for Families. I learned that it was costing us too much money to incarcerate and house one of our young people versus what it was costing us to educate our young people. And they were coming back less educated, torn apart, and families were expected to put the pieces together. And they were just coming back prepared to go to the adult system. And our young people are gifted, they're talented, and they should have an opportunity to thrive. So it hit home, and my communities are a revolving door. Many communities across the country where young people look like myself and you guys, that it's not okay. It's no longer okay to incarcerate and punish our kids for behavior that can be corrected, adolescent behavior. And parenting is one of the most challenging jobs. And we know that with resources, we can help young people thrive. Incarceration and the juvenile justice has just torn this apart.
And the perfect segue, Jeannette, thank you so much for underscoring how families are torn apart. To Dorothy Roberts. Dorothy, why is this conversation how Black families, Latino, Indigenous families are so impacted by the criminalization of children? Why does this conversation matter so much to you?
It matters so much to me because I've seen the devastation that what's called the child welfare system, and I and many others are calling a family policing system, has caused to families, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous families in the United States, and the way in which it fails to protect children. In fact, it criminalizes children. It doesn't keep them safe. It puts them in harm's way. It doesn't improve their welfare. It hurts their welfare. It diminishes their welfare. And so I think it's very important for us to see the connections between what's supposed to be a civil helping system and the criminal punishment system and juvenile detention system, because they're deeply entangled in multiple ways, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and because they cause so much harm that isn't getting enough attention. Too much propaganda about how wonderful and beneficial the family policing system is. We need to expose and tackle and abolish the way in which it's harming children and their families.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. And I so appreciate that response, because this notion of these systems supposedly being protective and helpful, and the reality in the fact that they cause harm, is such a connection between this family policing system and the system that many of us work in, the youth legal system. So let's start talking about this chapter. Chris, in the introduction of Rage of Innocence, you explain that your book is going to be about harms, the excessive intrusion of police into the lives of Black teenagers and their families. And you also tell us the book is going to be about resilience, strong Black families, heroic parenting, valiant teaching, really helping young people have affirming identities. And you talk, Chris, about the book being about revolution. And that we as advocates have to be part of that revolution for everyone who's willing to radically reduce the footprint of police and the day-to-day lives of children and their families. That's what you say this book is about. So today, as we talk about chapter 11, which details the devastating impact of criminalization of Black children and their families, one of the themes in this chapter is, how do we end the criminalization of Black children, and how can we ensure that all children have their right to childhood upheld? And when we focus on young people's rights to be with their families, and how criminalizing Black and Latino and Indigenous youth actually separates children from their families and impacts those rights. Chris, you start with the story of Kalief Browder and the impact the system has had on Kalief. So Chris, before we hear your answer, we're going to watch a brief video about Kalief from his mother, Benita Browder.
When he came out, he was not the same. There was too much baggage he brought from Rikers with him. The memory of beatings, starvation. There was times when he wasn't even allowed to take a shower for 2 weeks. He was angry. He started getting real paranoid. And his life just spiraled from that. My name is Benita Browder, and I'm the mother of Kalief Browder. Kalief was on his way home. A police car stopped, and I'm assuming the guy who made the complaint was in the car and told the police that Kalief had robbed him of a backpack. Kalief kept saying, I don't know this guy, I didn't rob him. He was told that they were gonna just go to the precinct to kind of sort things out. Well, that sorting out took 3 years. We went to court, we had a legal aid. And the legal aid told me from the beginning that it was a BS case. He said, don't worry about it, it's a BS case. But meanwhile, my son is being held at Rikers. He would tell me things when I would visit him about being beat. He told me, Ma, I gotta fight. If I don't, they're gonna think I'm soft. I gotta fight. All it did for Kalief was get him in more trouble and more days in solitary. Imagine being locked up 23 hours a day. This is your life. 4 walls, that's it. He couldn't take it. They told him, we're gonna break you. That's what they told my baby, that they're gonna break him. And in reality, they did. At first, you could see he was relieved, that he was home, he could do what he wanted. He started Bronx Community, and he was doing okay, but then, I mean, he was really out of it, and he couldn't keep it up. He quit. He felt that everybody was out to get him. Everybody was a police plant. He stopped speaking to friends. He would get real angry, and then there were times where he would just, this look would come over him, and he would just like stare. It was a Saturday morning. It was just me and Kalief, and I hear him upstairs doing all this moving around. And I'm like, maybe Khalif is positioning the furniture to get comfortable. I didn't pay attention because when Khalif is upset, he paces. Then all of a sudden I heard this boom. I run upstairs. I didn't see anything. I ran into the next room and the air conditioning cover was kicked out and I just saw something hanging. I ran back downstairs and as I opened the backyard door, Khalif was hanging there. I miss my son. I miss him so much.
Just want to take a minute and just acknowledge Khalif and his mother and the pain that this system, this criminalization, surveillance, policing of a child caused. We know that that's hard to watch, and we know it's hard for all of us who are here to acknowledge the devastating impact that the system has had. And in chapter 11, Chris begins with these powerful experiences that unfortunately so many families have had in this country. She tells the story of Tracy and Sabrina Fulton, who are the parents of Trayvon Martin, Lucy McBath and Ron Davis, the parents of Jordan Davis, Samaria Rice, the mother of Tamir Rice, Leslie McSpadden and Michael Brown, the parents of Michael Brown and others. Because if people, reading and having these conversations are aware of these significant, devastating harms, we all believe there has to be action, there has to be change, there has to be reform. So, Chris, in Things Fall Apart, chapter 11, why was it important to bring us all into this space, into this conversation in this way?
Let me start by saying it's going to be hard to talk about that this was by far the hardest chapter to write, period. I cried a lot. I had nightmares as I was writing it. And it was hard because I forced myself to watch interviews like Vernita Browder's and read the entire book, by, Mike Brown's mother, and look at documentaries, by Trayvon's family. All of that was important, and I felt the pain of every single word that was spoken by families, by their families. It was also really hard because it brought up a lot in me that I didn't realize was still there. Some of you know I lost my brother to the criminal legal system. He died in prison. He had an aneurysm in prison. And I think that when we talk about the harms of the criminal legal system and the family legal system, we think about the deaths, right? The brutality of people dying unnecessarily, unwarranted. There's nothing that anybody did. There's nothing that my brother did that would warrant the sort of the horrible health treatment that he got while he was there, such that he died as a result. I don't care what anyone says. And that's not to take anything away from victims of crime, but the ways in which we as a society respond and the ways in which we criminalize kids who don't even need that type of response in the system is really what got me and made me want to write this chapter, even as hard as it was. If we are serious about reform, if we are serious about abolition of these systems, then we need everyone to understand the entire story. We need everyone to understand all of the harms, right? All of the harms that are hidden within these systems, and to think about whether those harms outweigh or excuse me, whether or not those harms are justified, I should say, by the purported quote unquote benefits or of this system, either the family court system or the juvenile legal system. And so what do I mean here? It's just this notion of, we think of the child welfare system as helping. Well, guess what? We think about the juvenile legal system as being rehabilitative of children, right? Of holding children accountable for something that they have done wrong. But when we really look at it, when we look at stories like Kalief Browder's story, we think about all of the children who have been impacted by the system, then we have to ask ourselves, are we really achieving public safety and rehabilitation when we are presuming, first of all, that Black children like Kalief Browder are guilty, right? People who remember that story know Kalief Browder didn't, steal that book bag. He didn't rob anyone, right? So, but it's the presumption of guilt. So that's one. Are we achieving public safety and rehabilitation when we remove children from their homes, put them in facilities where they're held in solitary confinement, subject to physical abuse, where parents can't get there, where they can't visit, where kids come off worse off than when they went in, right? So much so that a child like Kalief Browder wants to take their own life, right? Or where my own brother ends up, with severe, with an aneurysm because his diabetes wasn't attended to, right? Where children don't get due process, where parents don't understand the system. So, I'll stop there. We're not achieving the goals of either of the two systems that we're talking about today. The other thing, though, the final thing I'll say about this chapter was that, notwithstanding the devastation that we expose in this chapter, I also wanted to highlight the fact that mothers like Vanita Browder took this moment of absolute tragedy to speak out, right? To become a champion for reform. And so I think about Vanita and Tracy Fulton and Rob Davis. I think about Jeannette Bocanegra, people who become advocates on the heels of these tragedies. And I think that's what I really wanted to also tell in this chapter. So both of those are so incredibly important. We got to know the whole story.
Chris, you said rehabilitation, reform. That's the opposite of what happens. They don't come back rehabilitated. They come back with more trauma, more exposed to more abuse. And again, the community is expected to put the pieces together, and the families is expected to understand what trauma that young person had experienced. And these systems are called systems of care. They don't care about our kids. That's one thing that I can tell you for sure. And the sad thing is that these practices, a young person is sent away, that's punishment enough. But the practices of workers imposing so much pain, I was watching the video and, it reminds me of so many other Kalief Browders that are back in our communities. And what is costing us today, $500,000 to house one loved one in that hellhole. And, we changed the law of criminal responsibility. 16-year-olds are no longer placed in rapists. But if half of the things that happens to young people in these facilities, a parent does it, she'll be held accountable and locked up. And no one is holding these systems accountable. There's no transparency. They all blame each other for their dysfunction, and they talk about families are dysfunctional. The hardest job, again, is to be a parent, but with the right resources, families can thrive. but the systems had just ripped us apart.
Let me jump in, and I just want to make it very clear for everybody listening that all these kinds of harms that we've heard about that happened to Kalief Browder and that Chris and Jeannette have been talking about happen to children who are taken from their families, supposedly to protect them, and put in a dangerous foster industrial complex, including what are euphemistically called residential treatment facilities or residential treatment centers, where often children in foster care and children who have been adjudicated delinquent are placed together in prison-like settings. These are often children who may have what is considered a behavioral problem or a mental health problem, or even for many Black teenagers, just because there isn't a foster home or even a group home available. And by the way, that they're not available because they're taking too many children away. It's not an excuse to say if there's no other place available. But children are put in these places without any medical justification. And even if there were one, it's not the kind of place to treat a child. No child, no matter why, whether they're considered delinquent or whether they've been taken.
I'll jump in just with some information. Young people that are ripped away from their homes and put into foster care, also high rate of going into the legal system. I too, as a community advocate, need to learn the appropriate language that's not dehumanizing as well. We use juvenile as that's a beautiful language. No, our young people are talented, they gifted, and they should be able to have an opportunity to thrive and be successful. So yet, so when we talk about the legal system, there's no way we can parallel the child welfare, the policing system. They all have ripped us apart equally, just as bad.
Thanks so much, Jeannette, for jumping in on that. And I think what you've heard from Chris and Dorothy and Jeannette are the devastating harms that both the family policing system and the juvenile legal system extract on children and their families, especially in terms of separating them and not caring for them, right? Like Jeannette, when you said these are not systems of care and they're called systems of care, it's such a misnomer. It really underscores.
It's so hard that families trust that by sharing maybe some of the difficulties of parenting, because it's okay to share challenges. A child and a manual is not attached when you give birth. As they grow, you also grow as a parent. And when you ask for help because you forget about the adolescent challenges, it's a punishment. You're not allowed to ask for help. It's punishing yourself. And if you don't have funding to put your child or look for the right resources, pro-social programs, a better school. We also know that schools have also been a large feeder to the juvenile justice system. We also know that the school uses the child welfare as a threat to families. So, none of them are transparent. None of them about reform, rehabilitation. We need to look at also what are some of these policies and practices that go on in these places, whether it's a visitation, whether it's, we talk about also mental health system and how that system is not consistent and providing cultural relevant support to young people and families. So
Jeannette, thanks for talking additionally about the experiences you have and how important it is for us to focus on policy and policy implications and what we can do as advocates. So we know parents have rights, we know that children have rights, and yet these two systems have a devastating toll on young people and families. So we want to take some time now to dig into what are the origins of these systems of care? So we've all heard this notion of parents patriae, this idea that the state has a place in caring for young people. We know its, origins are back in Old England, and it took root in this nation in a way that makes people think, and you heard all of, Chris and Jeannette and Dorothy say this already, it makes people who are not involved in these systems think that these systems are caretakers instead of harmful. So I just want to explore for a few minutes with Chris the historical underpinnings of this parents patriae notion, this idea that there's supposed to be a benevolent caregiver. And where is this grounded? Where do we see it in the Constitution? Who has these rights? Chris, can you just give us a little lesson on these rights for a few minutes?
Yeah, well, I'll get us started and certainly kick it to Dorothy to really talk about it. It's this notion of caretaker rights. I remember back in law school thinking about sort of the constitutional right to parental autonomy, right? Which is this notion that parents have a constitutionally protected right to raise their children as they deem appropriate with minimal government interference, right? And this fundamental liberty interest to care for and to raise children is actually 100 years old. And I don't mean that by hyperbole at all. Here I am thinking about the Supreme Court case from 1923, right? Exactly 100 years ago, Meyer versus Nebraska, which held that parental rights to establish a home and to bring up their children was protected by the Due Process Clause, right? That's the foundation. Since that time, the Supreme Court has explicitly accepted the historical presumption that the natural bonds of affection lead parents to act in this best interest of their children, right? And so there's normally no reason for the state to interject itself, right, in the private realm of the family, or to question the ability of the parent to make the best decisions concerning the rearing of the parents, the rearing of their own children, as it were. So you asked about this notion of parents patriae, right? This idea that the state has to step in. That's what parents patriae, the state as parent. We presume for most children that that's not necessary, but as we learned so beautifully from Torn Apart and from Dorothy Roberts' work, that look, Black and brown children are not given that presumption, right? At all. Black parents historically, from the very founding of our country, from the enslavement of Black children and from of Black people and the treatment of Black children as property, have not benefited from this constitutional right? Like the Black parents' constitutional right to be parents. And that either happens through biased or faulty assumptions about Black parents, right? Their purported inability to raise good, productive, and moral children, or through biased assumptions about the children themselves, and that they are incapable, of being managed, of behaving themselves or being managed by their own parents. And so therefore someone had to step in. So, but, I definitely, kick it to Dorothy to talk even more about that as a foundational disruption of that fundamental right.
Yes, and let me apologize. My internet went out, and I'm sorry that I disappeared for a minute. So relieved it came back.
We are too.
Just pick up where I was before, and I won't go into depth, but I was saying I want to make sure that everyone understands that children who are taken from their parents and put in the so-called foster care system are treated terribly, often in the same prison-like settings as children who are adjudicated delinquent. And there have been many cases of children who've been killed in these places, like Cornelia Fredericks in a so-called Lakeside Academy in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 2020, David Hess here in my current hometown of Philadelphia in 2016, Cornelius Fredericks because he threw a piece of bread in The cafeteria, David Hess accused of, well, they were just looking for a lost iPad. And for many of these children, their parents are waiting for them to come home. They've been taken from them. I'll just mention quickly, Makia Bryant, the teenager in Ohio who was killed by a police officer. She was in foster care in a home. A fight broke out. I won't go into the details, but she would not have been killed had she not been placed in this volatile situation. She was taken from her mother and then her grandmother for no reason at all. The grandmother, just because the landlord wouldn't let the children stay there because the landlord thought the apartment was too small for them. And as Jeannette has been saying, instead of giving support to the family, they take her away and she ends up being killed by a police officer. So these kinds of violences against children are happening in the so-called child welfare system as well. And as Chris was saying, there are the oldest substantive due process right recognized by the Supreme Court was the right to rear your children without state interference. And of course, we want the government to support the rearing of children, but not to terrorize families and take children away as a way of supposedly protecting children. And then, as Chris began to say, there is a long history of Black families being exempted from the protections of the Constitution. We would have to go back to the enslavement of Black people. Family separation was absolutely integral to the institution of slavery. Enslavers could sell off mothers, fathers, children, whenever they wanted to. And they did. Then after emancipation, judges would deem Black parents neglectful and put the children in apprenticeship, sometimes back to their very enslavers, and tens of thousands of Black children were taken from their families and put to work, re-enslaved, really, back with the white enslavers who had just lost the Civil War. And then think about the stereotypes about Black mothers, the most common ones. They're all about Black mothers who don't love their children. They have babies to get a welfare check. They're incompetent. They're lazy. And this idea that Black children and their mothers don't have, or their parents and other family members don't have strong bonds, I think is part of the root of why we see such high numbers of Black children taken from their families. 53% of Black children in America, that's more than half of Black children, will be subject to a child welfare investigation by the time they reach age 18. That means that this nation has no respect for the family bonds. If it investigates on accusations of maltreatment half of Black children, that is not respect for those family bonds. And these investigations are disruptive by themselves, let alone when they take the children away. So the parents' patriarchy idea that the state should come in to protect or to help raise children is subject to extreme racist concepts, and the very notions of family autonomy are so just embedded with white supremacy in America from the very origins of this nation. And they continue in these kinds of stereotypes that we know. I think Jeannette was saying there's lots of evidence of lots of studies documenting the kind of biases that, racist biases that influence decision-making, and structurally, the way in which the system is used as a weapon against marginalized communities. The history of it being used as a weapon of war against Indigenous tribes, as well as this long history of its use against Black people. So yes, interpretation of the Constitution has always been from the beginning shaped by white supremacy and racism. And this is a really blatant example of it.
And Dorothy, I'm so glad you mentioned the history in terms of tribes. And, when you look at the historic roots of oppression in this nation, in addition to enslavement, just the genesis and the origins of this country, and talk about the separation and destruction of families, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the impact on Native and Indigenous families.
Sure. So it's important to recognize that some of the early uses of family separation, child removal, were literally a military strategy to win the so-called Indian Wars in the second half of the 19th century. And this was not, some kind of child welfare policy. It was the military that decided that a way to weaken Native tribes was to steal children and put them initially in military camps. And then we see that developing into, again, a federal policy, an explicit federal policy of removing Native children which went on throughout the 20th century into the 1970s. And with some tribes being completely destroyed because so many Native children have been removed from their homes and placed in boarding schools, white-run institutions, or put up for adoption with white families. And again, this was explicit, deliberate federal policy in conjunction with the Child Welfare League of America to do this. It was the adoption policy. And the purpose of it now was also to decimate the tribes, in this case, through cultural assimilation. The idea was that tribes could be destroyed by assimilating the children into white families. And it was only with the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in the 1970s, after hearings in front of Congress, that the policy ended. But it's still the case today that Black and Indigenous children are the most likely of any children in America to be taken from their families, for their parental rights to be terminated. Black and Native children are twice as likely to have their both parents' rights terminated as white children in America. And so I don't think it's an accident that these two groups that were targeted for family separation continue today, in 2023, to be the two groups that are most disproportionately taken from their families and their families legally destroyed by the family policing system. Oh, and let me just add that the US Supreme Court has been chipping away at the Indian Child Welfare Act, and there is a case pending now. We haven't gotten a decision yet on perhaps even the continuation of ICWA, because who knows what these right-wing justices are going to decide about it. But in a prior case, despite the Cherokee Nation claiming a child and the child's father fighting for the child, and the child living with the father, being moved from the white potentially adoptive parents back to the father, the Supreme Court held that the father had no rights under the Indian Child Welfare Act because there wasn't a real Indian family. And also, by the way, suggested that the child, despite what the Cherokee Nation said, wasn't really Cherokee because she didn't have enough Cherokee, blood in her. Going back to these racist ideas about blood quantum. So the whole area now of protection for Native tribes' sovereign rights, which should be protected under ICWA, is up in the air. And despite ICWA, it hasn't been applied by state judges. They have been taking Native children away from their families and tribes in just atrocious numbers.
You know, I want to jump in and say these things, you know, I've learned so much during the past 13 years on juvenile justice and child welfare. And again, there's so much data of the harm that was created by those two systems. And where do we go when there's so much data, that there's so much proven that they've not done a better job than if a child stay home or in the community? And then with so much underlying issues that have not been properly addressed, many folks are saying, let's roll back some of these laws and policies because we've been wrong. No, we have to continue discussing these issues. You know, many folks don't want to talk about the racial disparities, and, you know, we have oppressors teaching the oppressed how to fight oppression. I thought that adoption and foster care, you know, I knew not to get in trouble. I grew up around Spofford. I knew not to get in trouble because that's where you was gonna go. But if we know better today, why are we still housing young people in these institutions that have not done a better job? I am still trying to heal my family from my son returning home, which was a hard job. And it helped me understand what we need to do in our communities and in our homes. And it had nothing to do with system. I'm gonna say that she's gonna be proud that I'm gonna say this. Joyce, we're gonna abolish these systems. We no longer can trust that they're gonna do a better job because we cannot afford to lose another generation. We've lost enough generations, and our children are talented. Again, they're beautiful, they're gifted. And every parent, no matter where we come from, we want our children to succeed. We want them to be productive citizens in society, to have their own families if that's what they wish. But what we're giving them is tearing them apart. And many of our homes don't know how to put those pieces together.
Thanks so much, Jeannette.
I'm just grateful that the work that you all do for communities that sometimes we don't understand, but we need to partner with communities in order to understand and make a difference.
And we're so grateful to you, Jeannette, for the work you're doing to strengthen families' voices in these systems. And, you know, the data that both Dorothy and Chris share in their books, it is astounding. It's unconscionable how it doesn't make any sense how these systems can continue. We all know it doesn't make any sense. One of the ways in which protectors of these systems pretend that these systems are fair and just is through the use of risk assessments. And Dorothy, I was really struck and torn apart by your description of the risk instruments that are used in the family policing system. We're so familiar with and struggle so much with the bias-laden instruments that are used in the juvenile policing system. But I was really struck by the powerful data you present on the bias and racism that's baked into these instruments. And could you just talk a little bit about those for our community of defenders that I know really wants some advocacy instruments to use?
Sure. So in the same way that police departments are increasingly using fancy algorithms and predictive analytics and big databases to identify neighborhoods that are considered hot spots and, you know, to predict crime. So they send in intensive police surveillance into those neighborhoods, which always just happen to be, you know, Black and brown neighborhoods. More and more child welfare departments are also hiring companies, data analytic companies, to engage in the same kind of predictive policing. So these companies like IBM and SAS and others that have been hired with, huge contracts. What they do is collect lots of information about families, including the networks that the families belong to. They collect records from schools, from hospitals. SAS boasts on its website that it collects information anywhere that it's stored. And then they have algorithms, which, by the way, are proprietary information for these companies. So the public doesn't know how they're making these determinations, but they run a computer program algorithm, using these data, and decide which families are at risk for maltreating their children, and then alert the child welfare investigators to go and investigate these families. Now, some people say, oh, isn't that good? That makes it more accurate. They can more accurately identify the families to investigate. This improves child welfare. But in fact, we know from many studies, again, that these algorithms and the databases themselves bake in racism, because the factors they look at are more likely to target people of color. And those factors might include someone in the family having a criminal conviction, but we know that criminal convictions are racially biased or racist, right? And then in addition, the algorithms may look for certain kinds of factors that would more likely identify Black and brown families, Indigenous families, and the data that is collected has within it prior encounters with the child welfare system. So it just then feeds upon itself. But then I want to say that there's other problems with this. Chris talked about the protection of privacy that we should have, the US Constitution supposedly gives us. The Fourth Amendment, it's as if child welfare or family policing have been exempted from the Fourth Amendment. People think that because it's supposed to protect children, constitutional protections don't apply, that families shouldn't have constitutional rights because the government is coming in to protect children. And so this gives the government this broad power that doesn't even exist in the criminal legal system. At least shouldn't, we would acknowledge these rights. I'm not saying they're actually provided to people, but at least there's an acknowledgement. Courts acknowledge that the Fourth Amendment applies to police investigations, but there are courts that have exempted effectively the child welfare system from this protection. And then also the idea that you can predict which children are at risk and move in on the families. It ignores the harm of the investigation itself. And this is all premised on this carceral logic that the way in which to support children is to accuse their parents and other family caregivers, investigate and punish. So for all those reasons, and let me just add one more thing, is as I cite in Torn Apart, a couple studies in Chicago and Los Angeles that looked at these predictive analytic tools and found that there were a substantial number of false positives. In other words, they predicted that there was going to be child abuse and neglect in a home when in fact there wasn't. And again, that means that this family now comes under the scrutiny of this system and has to undergo an investigation, which could involve strip searching children to look for evidence of abuse and neglect, collecting records, searching every corner of the home, and just the terror the terror that families experience when these agents come into their home and threaten to take their children away. I mean, it's the most terrifying thing that can happen to you, the fear from families. And, we've been talking about, why don't people see this? It's because these families are devalued. There isn't the sense that this is terrifying to them, that we should care about them. We should care about the fear and horror they face in not knowing what's going to happen to their children, or in their children being taken away from them. Jeannette, go on.
Professor, I love children. I love children, but I'm glad I don't have small children, because the child welfare system is such a horrific system. I'm glad I didn't get touched by that system, but just the thought of it, it wants to rip me apart from the inside. But I also worked on a COVID-19 research project on how young people were being released from detention. The numbers dropped with incarceration, but schools were using the child welfare system as a threat when a young person, educational neglect, when a young person didn't turn on their camera to join through Zoom. And I couldn't believe that for the most petty things, whether a young person turned the camera on or not, you want to call the child welfare system on a parent for educational neglect? Can you ask if the young person feels comfortable with the background that he has? Is there enough maybe space, or how many siblings are using that small space? So, I've learned so much about how harmful the child welfare system is, that again, we can't trust that system to do a better job in raising children or keeping families together. Abolish. Joyce, that's 2 times.
Do people, I don't know, I'm not sure if everybody knows the Joyce that Jeannette is referring to, but she's referring to Joyce McMillan, who founded JMAC for Families in New York City. She's a friend of both mine and Jeannette's, and we are abolitionists. Yes.
And she's an amazing advocate. Whenever I have a family with an issue with the child welfare, I have her on speed dial. And if the child protective service worker wants to meet with the parent in their home, I said, no, you're not going to their home. You come into my office because there's no investigation.
And Dorothy does a beautiful job talking about Joyce in her book, Torn Apart, as well, where we can learn more about her. Chris, compounding these horrifically racist instruments in the juvenile legal system, can you talk about the impact?
Yes, I mean, and I think maybe what I'll do is talk about it from the lens of this risk assessment instruments. And,
yes.
Look, in the same way that, Dorothy talked about in the juvenile legal system, folks hold out a risk assessment instrument as the great equalizer, the way to ensure that everybody is treated equally. But, junk in, junk out, right? And so, if the factors built into the risk assessment instruments used in the juvenile legal system are just the wrong factors to be asking, or factors deeply laden with racist presumptions, then we're going to merely perpetuate, the racism and the disproportionality and the harms of these systems. And so I think about pretrial detention risk assessments, right? Or risk assessment instruments that are used on the back end once a child has been adjudicated as involved. Think about what some of those factors are, right? A child and their family, they get an extra point, a risk point, when the child doesn't live in a 2-parent household, when the child's family or parent, guess what, has been involved in this family policing system, right? When the parent is not working, when a parent is working, but yet misses a court hearing because they can't get off work to come to the court hearing, right? When a sibling, this one blew me away. I think it's been removed in our jurisdiction, but there was a point at which either the front end risk assessment instrument or the back end risk assessment instrument in where I practice had siblings. So having a sibling involved in the system was considered as an extra risk factor, which is just so disturbing on so many levels. And I've seen a couple of questions pop up in the chat and in the Q&A about what is the role of defenders. Let me just insert a practice point. We'll try to do that throughout, but like we have an obligation as defense counsel to, one, really demand copies of the risk assessment instrument and not just settle for the score, right? Sometimes we get the risk assessment score in court, but we need to be able to do the analysis that Dorothy's talking about and that I'm talking about, and we can only do that if we actually see the instrument that's used. And if it's not readily available, demanding it by FOIA, engaging in what Jeannette has been talking about, policy reform until abolition. We're going for abolition, but until then, really pressing for the removal or the elimination of these risk assessment instruments, period. Also demanding transparency in the data. And this is what I know we've talked about in various sessions, racial impact statements, right? So what's the racial impact of using this particular instrument? You can't tell me on the back end, well, I didn't know it would have a disproportionately racial impact. You could ask anybody on this call and we could tell you that it's going to have a racially disproportionate impact. So I think some of that is really, really important. The other thing that I want to say about the intersection, you asked Marianne about the intersection between these two systems, and in particular, how they exacerbate one another. It's such a vicious vortex, right? So the involvement in each system makes the involvement in the other system worse, right? So when a child, for example, has been removed from their home, through the family policing system under the guise of protection and child welfare, they are actually more likely to have their normal adolescent behaviors criminalized, landing them in the juvenile legal system, right? Because they have less privacy in their day-to-day lives, more surveillance and restrictions in a group home or foster setting, less free time for play, recreation, leisure, more likely to have a caseworker who's calling the police for dumb stuff like Jeannette talked about, like, sorry, I shouldn't be so, but, for stuff that just shouldn't be, referred. So it's not just that the parent is being, a case is being opened on the parent for stuff that doesn't belong in the system. But then once the family's in the system, then the kid gets referred to the juvenile legal system. They get arrested. And then like a child who's on probation, right? In the juvenile legal system, who acts like a child, who acts like a teenager, for example, is more likely to end up with a probation violation if they're also in the family legal system. So what do I mean by that? So, when you miss curfew, and you live at home with your parents, or if you oversleep for school, or you miss a family meeting, what does your parent do? They have internal disciplinary consequences. When you're in the family legal system in a group home, you can get arrested for that or violated on probation for that, sent back to detention. And I just don't think we think about that, right? And then, just adding, this is the most extreme one. This is fascinating, I think, and it's such a complicated question in a conversation between Dorothy and I, right? This notion that in our delinquencies, in my experience, very often, a child who is in the family policing system, a caseworker or other folks who are involved in the case are more likely to ask that the child welfare, the dependency case, be closed, terminated when a child gets arrested in the delinquency case. So it's ridiculous. It's like really complicated because we don't want the kid and the family in either system, but it's fascinating the way we work. We say that the child should be ripped from the home, placed in the family, through the family legal system, or get services. Let me retract that. They get services and help through the family policing system, this child welfare system. But the second the kid acts out, they're like, oh, no, we don't need that. Let's just treat the child through these delinquency facilities in the delinquency system. And I have to say to you, this is a word for defense attorneys. I know that when I was a baby lawyer, I am ashamed to admit it, but I think it's important to admit this. When I was a baby defense lawyer, we used to think that it was better to have our kid in the family legal system than in the juvenile legal system. So if I were given the option to make an argument, well, no, Your Honor, this case really isn't about delinquency. It's really about child welfare. It's really about the services that the system in the child welfare context can provide better for that kid. Oh, let me tell you, how wrong was I? They're both such bad systems. You will never hear me make that argument again, that we should close a delinquency case in order to get a kid in the child welfare system. They're both such bad systems, but it's such a complicated, it's counterintuitive. People think they buy into the language, even defense attorneys, we buy into the narrative that this is a helping system. And so we want our kid there, and we have to stop doing that.
You know, I had to stop many parents in New York from filing a petition against their adolescent, a person in need of supervision. I said, you're opening the doors to lose your parental rights and enter them into the juvenile justice system. So let's find other alternative ways to help you understand adolescent behavior, because what the system is going to do is disrupt their development. You know, I heard, Danielle from the Annie Casey Foundation speak on, and when she said, what the system has been doing is disrupting their proper development. And we can't continue allowing that.
Thanks, Jeannette. And thanks so much, Chris and Dorothy. So we've talked about the fact that parents are supposed to have these rights to parent. Our nation, in addition to all of the other harms that it's perpetrated against children, we don't actually have a right that's embodied in our law for children to have integrity of their families, right? In the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, children have a right to their family. They have a right to be part of that family, because we know families are protective and caring, and they help with development. And absent that, we as advocates have to be making those arguments about our children's rights to the integrity of being with their families and in their homes. And we've heard so much about the devastating impact. I'll use Chris's term, the vicious vortex, of the intersectionality between these two policing systems. So what we're going to do now is dive a little bit deeper into some of the specific consequences. And we're going to start where our question in the chat is, which is really looking at harms and abuses, conditions, physical harms children suffer in the hands of both of these systems, whether it's in solitary, through shackling, pepper spray. Chris, I'm just going to start by asking you, could you just give us, what is the landscape of some of these harms before we dive into any of them specifically? What are the many ways in which this vicious vortex and this intersectionality really impacts young people and their families?
Yeah, and I think, this, let me do just a quick list and we could just pick any one of them to dive in. When I think about the harms, and you started naming some of them, the trauma that the child and the entire family experience when a child experiences this physical abuse, the pepper spray, the solitary confinement, even the handcuffing and shackling of young children, period, but especially of young children. And there have been some really high profile, painful cases of 10-year-olds, being handcuffed and set on the curb, and literally, parents sobbing in interviews, watching their 10-year-old sit on the curb. Was there no other way you could regulate, you could, redirect a 10-year-old? Or I remember being in court, the first time I ever saw a parent, burst out crying. Our children in our courts are brought from the back. They're brought from behind the judge out into the room, and they're brought in shackles, and parents burst out crying. And that is such a painful thing to watch. That's one thing, right? I think about the barriers to visitation. Vanita Bratter talks about that, how difficult it was to see her son at Rikers. I live in Washington, D.C. Our children are sent to residential treatment facilities all over the United States, right? How difficult it is to go visit. I think about the loss of housing. This is a collateral impact people don't think about. The fact that entire families can be evicted or excluded from, denied, I should say, admission to public housing. as a result of a child's arrest, right? Homelessness as a collateral consequence. I think about the challenges parents face in helping their children navigate these legal systems, right? They don't know, they're not lawyers. I think about parent alienation from their children, siblings alienation from one another when one child is ripped from the home. I think about the significant imposition of fines, fees, bail, other financial costs that decimate the family. I think about the immigration consequences, right? And I think about the barriers to education for youth in the legal system. That's just a list. So I'll let you take us where you want to go with that, Marianne.
Thanks, Chris. And the list can go on, right? So Chris, thanks for just lifting up some of the consequences of harm and devastation of these. Let's just lean in a little bit farther into these physical harms. And, Jeannette, I'm gonna just ask you, in one of the videos that we watched, you recall how your son was in solitary and was pepper sprayed. And can you talk about, if you're comfortable sharing, what impact that had on him and what advice you give to families?
The impact was, I saw when he came home. Our young people are resilient when going through those horrible treatment. And they come back like they look strong. They handle the pain, the trauma, the traveling far, far away, miles and miles away. I tell folks, if I moved to Canada, I would have been closer to him. I got to witness the trauma a couple of weeks after he returned home, not right away. I say it was the honeymoon stage. Everyone is happy. I can see my son in his room. He had never spent the night out. He was taken away at 14 and returned at 20. I felt like a mom nesting. I'm going to buy his new clothes, a new bed. I'm going to paint his room. My baby's coming home. He was the youngest of 6. So we were all happy. But when the trauma kicked in, it destroyed my home. It turned my whole home upside down. But I also know that the communities and families like myself, we become conditioned to, if we witness that, we're going to call the cops. The first responders should be the cops. If he can't be home and be civilized, he's going to have to go back. But I knew that that was not what I was conditioned to learn and to do. It took time to help him understand that we are your family. This is your home. The community that he was taken away from knew who he was before he was even born. So they all helped him understand that he was needed, and we were not going to allow him to take the system to take him away. I learned about recidivism and how quickly young people return to these systems. But I knew that I couldn't allow him to go back, and that my work was going to be helping communities rebuild so that we can embrace everyone returning home. Whether it's a young person that was taken through the foster care to returning back home, how do we support this family to make sure that, because we always want to come back home no matter where they send us to. They could take us away and put us in this fancy place, but our heart want to go home. We want to go home. No one wants to be removed from their home. But we also know that we have been tearing families apart and not investing in communities. And if we can invest those same dollars that we invest in facilities, and in New York is almost $800,000 a year for a youth facility, and the outcomes are not any better. So families, we want to do the work. We want our children home. We love our children. Love is very powerful, but we also need support. We cannot rely on systems. I also learned through Georgetown, the crossover youth and how young people are just crossing from one system to another. And families are overwhelmed. You may hear families saying, well, I'd rather have my kid in that facility. Not because she knows that he's being harmed, because she knows where he's at or she is at. Because she thinks that they're going to do a better job. Because we think that they are systems of care. And because many of the folks that are delivering the services look like us as well. And the practices are just horrible. Because we also know that many of them are siblings. and no one has given them the opportunity to heal and to bring their families together. I mean, I can just go on. It's painful. Just looking at the Khalid Browder story, you know, it breaks my heart. He lived a few blocks from where I currently live. I'm in Puerto Rico now, but I'm from New York. Just point of clarification. And my community is one of those $1 million blocks where young people are just a revolving door, and we are going to disrupt that. We no longer want to be able to see our kids go into these systems that have been harming them.
And Jeannette, you make so many important points in that. Just, young people want to be with their families. And Dorothy, you talk about that when young people escape from these horrible placements, they go home. And, the misinvestment of all of our dollars, all of our tax dollars into these harmful systems. And the work you're doing, Jeannette, is just so important. That's the supportive work that should be happening, that should be paid for with our tax dollars. And so we're just so grateful to you for doing that and giving that support. And Dorothy, in Torn Apart, you share so many stories of the physical abuses and harms children face in the family policing system. And can you talk a little bit about the impact of those systemic abuses on families?
Well, I think it should be clear, and there's lots of both psychological, international treaties and conventions. We heard it all when President Trump intensified the removal of children, migrant children at the border, and there was a flood of testimony and reports and news stories about how harmful it is to children to take them from their families. And so we know the trauma to both children and their loved ones when they are forcibly separated. But I think we have to ask, well, then why is it ignored when it comes to our communities? Why don't people see that Black families, for example, they have experienced the same kind of trauma? And I think there is this idea that anything, despite the harms, there's so little benefit to Black children of being with their families that it's better to take them away. This can be seen. I've heard these kinds of statements made by researchers and policymakers, and I point in Torn Apart to studies that have found these kinds of statements made that, yes, there's trauma, but it's still better. The Black children will still be better off apart from their families, apart from their communities. So that's some of the kind of racist stereotypes, again, we have to continue to battle. And then there's also, you mentioned, Marianne, how I referred to stories and studies that show, and Jeannette mentioned as well, that children want to go back to their families. One of the harms to children and families is that it's so horrible in this foster industrial complex that many children run away. And some of them do run back to their families, in which case, if they're caught, they're put back into foster care or they're punished. As Chris was saying, and in Torn Apart, I say there's a thin line between the family policing system and the juvenile legal system when it comes to children. When they run away, they're seen then as problem children. And again, as Chris was saying, they will call the police on these children. That's one of the reasons why they end up then in the youth legal system. or in the criminal legal system. And then even apart from that direct, calling the police and putting them in juvenile detention, there's the later risk, as Jeannette was saying, some of these harms show up later on. And so they're well documented, the risk of houselessness, the risk of future incarceration, the risk of low income or poverty, the risk of suicide, the high rates of suicide among children who've been separated from their families. And one study found that children in foster care have higher rates of PTSD than war veterans. So all of these harms, emotional, physical, economic, and I don't know, you can tell me, Marian, if we're going to get to this later, but I do want to mention, someone talked about fees, and maybe Chris, that was one of those. The way in which children and their families are exploited financially by the family policing system. Parents who are given a bill for the care that the state gave to their children when the children were forcibly taken from them, or children who are put back in foster care because the parents can't afford the bill that they've been given. In addition, many of these child welfare departments become the financial representative of the children while they're in state custody and deliberately in fact, they look for children who are going to get Social Security benefits, death benefits, or disability benefits, and they take that money away from the children. So you have children aging out of foster care who should have thousands and thousands of dollars that they were entitled to from the federal government, and it's all been spent, not on them, but to meet budget shortfalls in the state. So on top of all these harms that are being inflicted on them that jeopardize their ability to earn a living and their family's ability to make do, they're stealing money that the children are entitled to. So it's just a racket of exploitation that is, yes, the vortex of, all these harms and the way in which they entangle children. I want to, if I could just make a couple more points that Chris and Jeannette reminded me of. One, Chris's point about how these children go from family policing system into the youth legal system. There's this common idea that this happens because these children are troubled children. There's something wrong with them. And that's part of the reason why they're so easily cut off from care and become seen as future criminals. There's something wrong with them. No, it's the system that is structured to put them into the youth or the adult criminal legal system. And then I want to emphasize something Jeannette has been saying about telling parents, don't call CPS on your children. They're not going to help your children. And it just reminds me of the way in which in many communities, because the communities have been stripped of all investment by the state and also by, private companies other than privatizing child welfare services, there aren't the generous supports that families should get. And so many families feel forced to rely on this punitive system. They know it's a punitive system. They know it's terrible, but they're desperate for some way to provide for their families or deal with children who may have difficulties, challenges. And so I want to emphasize also what Jeannette has been saying. We have to provide and build community-based resources for families. That's the answer. The answer isn't to get more child welfare agents into homes, take more children away. Why would we want to expand a system that we know is harmful? It has to be to provide, build up. And when I say provide, I don't just mean waiting for someone else to, build these, that we in our communities need to be building them. But I also agree with Jeannette that all that billion, when we look nationally at all the money that's spent by the federal government and state and local governments on the family policing system, it's upwards of $40 billion a year. I absolutely agree. That money, I think Chris said this as well, put that money in the hands, directly in the hands of family caregivers, and children would be so much better off than they are under these brutal, vicious, violent systems.
You know how much I can do with $100,000 for one kid?
Can you imagine? Can you imagine? I mean, there's like, we need research, but research shows even the amounts that were given under the COVID relief package help to reduce child poverty dramatically. And you get these studies that say, oh, children were better off. Like, you need a study to prove it. Clearly, children are going to be better off if their families have more income. That should be common sense.
COVID highlighted all the disparities across every system. And it also highlighted that we can make discretionary decisions without worrying about a policy.
Yes, it did. That we can move more agile than the system pretends it can. Absolutely. And, all of this dollar for dollar, we know if all this money was spent actually on young people and families, we'd be in a better place. But Chris, what do we do as defenders? What do we do understanding the harms and the disparities and the racism in the system as advocates?
Yeah, I have to say how much I am enjoying the conversation, in particular, how much I'm learning about other systems. That was why I loved, Torn Apart. Two words pop in my head. One is follow the money. I'm now thinking about, as Dorothy said, the ways in which, folks, I as a defense attorney have never really thought about that, like the ways in which the money that should be going to children through the system is being, sent to agencies or, withheld from the child. But follow the money was one thing. But more importantly, Marianne, what I'm also thinking is the absolute need to provide stated interest attorneys, expressed interest attorneys to children who are in both systems, right? And so I will say in my own personal practice, if I have a child who is dually involved, I will show up in that family court case, right? And engage not as the guardian ad litem, right? But as the stated interest attorney for that child, so that I can represent exactly what Jeannette has said, what Dorothy has said, is the child is saying, I want to go home, right? And then figuring that out, right? So this is all, very often my comments are pre-abolition. I want abolition, but I know that a child tomorrow is going to end up in the system. And so what do I want to do for that child? I want to represent the child in both systems. I also really want to ensure that I, as a defense attorney, we as defense counsel do a better job collectively about asking our clients the right questions when they are held in these facilities, right? So ensuring adequate post-disposition representation in the delinquency system. Or again, if my kid is dually involved, if the kid goes to one of these quote unquote, child welfare institutions, really family policing institutions, or homes like where Ma'Khia Bryant was, am I visiting that child at that home, at that group facility, at the larger residential congregate care, and asking the right questions? Did you eat today? Is it warm? Have you been able to call and visit your family? Is there any evidence of abuse whatsoever. What makes you sad? What makes you happy? What makes you cry? What makes you worried? I'm now really, as I talk out loud, thinking about how to improve my client interviewing for kids who are in one of these systems, in one of these facilities or placements in either one of the systems, right? Then once I get the answers to those questions, raising constitutional and statutory challenges to these practices, again, until I can get my kid out or till I can abolish the system. So challenging solitary confinement. There's been some great work by a number of organizations, and I'm sure our colleagues will drop in the chat, but are we litigating 8th Amendment and 14th Amendment challenges to solitary confinement, right? Drawing upon a standard that is rooted in adolescent development, right? Not in adult standards for challenging solitary confinement, but no child, right, should be in solitary confinement, right? And the ways in which, as Jeannette talked about, how our responses are developmentally harmful. The ways in which we incarcerate youth in these facilities is developmentally harmful. And it seems to me, as I listen, that these arguments are true in both systems, right? Bringing education claims, right? In other words, a child in solitary confinement or in general population is being denied a meaningful education, right? Really important. Challenging discriminatory practices within those facilities. So I think about Khalif Browder and the ways in which he was physically abused, the ways in which he was held in solitary confinement. I think about the now exonerated 5 and the ways in which they were, treated and handled. A lot of that was discriminatory, discriminatory responses within the facility towards Black youth, right? And towards Latino and Latina youth, those kinds of things. So all of it, I could go on and on. Federal disability law. So many of the young people in the system have cognitive limitations or, other educational disabilities that can become the basis for a legal challenge of young people. Community partnerships, working with families and community advocates around these issues. All of this to say, we as defenders, as youth advocates, have a huge role to play, and particularly with our kids who are dually involved in both systems.
I wanted to jump in and also share how we also need to educate folks about adolescent behavior and what are the things that young people do at those ages. And when young people are in these facilities, they do things just like every teenager. They'll suck their teeth. They don't want to do certain things. And, they get treated in harmful ways for those behaviors. And, we want them to be open about those treatments, but there's also retaliation.
Right.
And there's also this, I'm not going to say anything because you're going to leave and I'm going to stay here. And,
Right.
They're going to treat me even worse if I say something. So it's hard to be open and honest when we know that our young people, whether it's a family or a lawyer visiting, and if they share and we complain or say something about it, it'll be worse for the young person.
So I'm glad you touched on visiting and the complexity and difficulty of really sharing what's happening to young people. So I'd like to spend a couple minutes on the barriers to visitation, because we know the destruction of families is rooted in keeping them separated. And when you think about both the family policing system and the juvenile legal system, the significant barriers to being connected to your family that these systems impose is just, again, it's unthinkable. So I want to ask, Jeannette, just to talk a little bit about those barriers. Chris, I know you've got some research that you write about on the significant harms that keeping families apart and the impact causes. And Dorothy, you've got research and writing in Torn Apart about family separation. And as you each have a touch on the barriers to visitation and keeping families connected, Jeannette, you touched on some of the costs. You talked already about how much it is to make visits. And Dorothy, you talked about the fees these systems impose. So I want to start with Jeannette, but I want to touch on this visitation and costs before we ask for each of you to take 5 minutes to wrap up. Jeannette. Visitation.
Visitation, I felt, again, I was fortunate I didn't have a younger kid to worry about if I'm gonna have childcare so that I can visit whichever one in the child that I'm visiting. There's also financial restraints, how much it costs to be able to get on that bus ride. And usually those bus trips are overnight trips. You don't get there in a couple of hours. So the barriers can be from language, finances, childcare, elder care. We also have families that are taking care of an elder. So we're not even looking at elder care. We talk about childcare, the distance, and also restrictions with facilities. We have families that once they get there, it's like, well, did you call before you decide? Was the visiting day? I'm sure that I can visit according to the policy that you have. I can visit. Well, you should have called. Many of these places, I felt like you need to go unexpected visits so that you can see how young people are being treated. But the barriers come from language to distance to finances. There's also fines and fees that families deal with, court fees. So the family policing and the legal system with young people, they're so aligned. There's nothing different. One tells you, I'm going to be a better parent than you, and the other one is going to tell you, I'm going to show you how you raise a child. This is how you raise a successful child, and this is what parenting looks like. And neither one of them can prove that they've done a better job.
Yeah, and look, I'll jump in. It's so funny. We think that we remove children from home as a consequence of their alleged delinquent behavior, which, mind you, is often just normal adolescent behavior. And we think that we're doing them good. But the research is clear that even when children have been impulsive, they're testing limits, they're pushing boundaries, they are, allegedly or even actually engaging in delinquent behavior, the research shows they still need their parents, and that their parents still provide an influential voice of guidance and redirection. The research shows that young people who have strong bonds with their parents, even when they have visitation, I should say, and family engagement while they are in placement, actually have demonstrated less recidivism than kids who were sent away and have no contact with family. And this is both within the facility and after return, right? So that a child who gets those family visits is more likely or less likely to have those incident reports that we read about, right? And so all of the things that, Jeannette talked about, the barriers, right? There's research showing that members of socioeconomically of groups or families that are socioeconomically better off have more visits and thus have less behavioral infractions in facility and then get home earlier, right? So that suggests that we have to have policies and practices that reduce that disparity and that increase the opportunity for all family members, all children to have those visits. The other thing is, because I've been driving home this point about what can we do as defenders and youth advocates, we have to be paying attention to that. That has to be a critical piece of our advocacy. Are we asking the question, how many visits have you had? Are you talking to staff at the facility? Did a child lose their home visit or their Zoom call or their telephone call as a punishment for some infraction in the facility? I'm sorry, that is not the answer. That is not the response, is to deny that. The research shows quite to the contrary. It's actually maybe that parent who can talk them down and can help them calm down. Maybe it's the trauma. It's a trauma response. The kid is acting out because they miss their mother, but because of adolescent bravado, they can't say that. Right. And so instead they act out. I mean, it's just, I could go on and on.
I couldn't believe they would do stuff like that, yes. Professor. I couldn't believe, because of the small infraction, you're taking away a visit, you're taking away family day. So right. These are practices that we can allow folks to continue doing.
Yeah, and it's interesting and disturbing that when we talk about family policing, the way in which visits are used in a similar way of surveillance and punishment. So parents want to visit their children. Of course, their children have been taken from them, right? So they want to visit their children, but the conditions of visitation are made in a way that it becomes onerous to visit. So imagine a parent who maybe doesn't have a car and had 3 children, and the 3 children, talk about sibling separation, are put in 3 different placements in different parts of the city. Now, she has to visit all 3 children, not on her time. She's given a schedule when she has to do it. And the children may be in placements that don't want to cooperate to help her. So that might make it difficult as well. Then the visits might be at another location that's supervised because they want to inspect how she's relating to her children. Now, can you imagine someone is sitting there taking notes as you're interacting with your child who's been taken from you and may blame you because they don't understand why they can't come home? And, you know, as others are saying, they're upset, they're traumatized. And now you have an agent taking notes on the nature of the relationship, and anything, I'm telling you, anything the parent does, if the parent seems too happy, oh, why are they happy when their child was taken away from them? I've seen this. I'm telling you, I've seen this. The parent is sad. Why is the parent is depressed? They're not good for the child. The parent's angry. Oh, they're angry, they're belligerent. So every single thing that goes on can be used against the parent in supervised visitation, and this happens. Then, same thing about punishment. Both children are punished by taking away visits, and parents are punished if they don't do something else on the list of mandates. Now, you have to understand, when children are taken away, the parents are given a list of mandated so-called services, but they're actually tasks that they have to perform to get their children back. And they've got to manage that along with the visits. And if they miss anything, a meeting with a caseworker, a meeting with a therapist, a job interview, some meeting to get housing, a visit, they're late for a visit, anything, that can be grounds for terminating their parental rights because they didn't comply with everything. And those are the conditions of visitation. It becomes not something to help the family thrive, because first of all, the children shouldn't have been taken away in the first place, but it's not to help the family thrive. It's used as a weapon. It's, children are being weaponized against the rest of the family. And it's not in any way conducive to supporting the family bond.
And Dorothy, when we read about that in Torn Apart, and I hope everybody on the program tonight will read both Torn Apart and Rage of Innocence and Jeannette's report that she'll talk about in a few minutes. I was just struck by the parallels between what's purportedly a service plan and what we call, probation.
Yes.
This idea that there's going to be support for young people. It just was so striking. That again, this pretend notion that it's a system of care is so harmful. So we're going to have the last few minutes for each of our esteemed participants really to wrap up and give us their concluding thoughts for 3 minutes each. And I hope to be able to still get a 60-second summation for your best advice for the community after that. And I want to start with Professor Roberts. And you wrote so much about the harms in Torn Apart. And what you say we need to do is a total paradigm shift. Could you just help us understand that? What are we supposed to do?
Sure. So, and the word abolition has come up a few times. Jeannette let Joyce McMillan know that she supports abolition. And I think it's important to understand that we are supposed to abolish the system. And that means both dismantling the systems we have now, but also, just as importantly, at the same time, building up a radically different way of keeping children safe and supporting families, caring for each other, community-based, generous, non-coercive, non-punitive. And so how do we do that? Now, one, I think, helpful way to think about it is what Ruth Gilmore coined as non-reformist reforms. We do have to work incrementally. And I don't think of abolition as this endpoint so much as a vision of what we're building every day. And what can we do to move toward that vision? So I believe that family defense is a step toward that vision. I agree with Chris. We have to mitigate as much as possible the suffering that's going on right now that children and their family members are undergoing. And some ways to do that are the kinds of things that JMAC for Families has been advocating. And Jeannette talked about educating people, educate families about their legal rights. Their legal right under the Fourth Amendment not to have government agents invade their home without a warrant. And work with legislators to make that clear, and judges to enforce what's already in the US Constitution but isn't being applied. It also, it means multidisciplinary family defenders that are there to represent the family at the very beginning, as soon as a family is accused. And as Chris was talking, that made me think about how when we think of multidisciplinary, we usually think of having peer, parent advocates, as well as lawyers, as well as social workers. But also, as Chris was emphasizing, having discussions of the family, of the juvenile defenders, and the criminal law legal defenders, I hope I'm using the right terms, and the family defenders, because these children are involved in all of these systems. And the point of it is to keep children from ever getting into the foster industrial complex, and then how can we shift funds away from these systems and get them into the hands of families, and also building within our communities. And we have lots of legacies of doing this already. We just need more support and more organizing, unrelated to these systems, not relying on the family policing system, but our community-based resources, mutual aid and other kinds of resources for families, so that they don't have to call CPS because they're desperate for resources or ways to deal with the child they're having trouble with.
And perfect segue to Jeannette, of course. We need more resources in communities and community advocates. Jeannette, can you talk to us about unlocking futures and the solutions, your vision for how we can radically?
I've been working on the solution to the juvenile crisis since we released our report in 2012. And what our report highlighted that there was a crisis in the juvenile justice system across the country. I took the lead in New York, and it's still my call to action workbook. We worked with probation here in New York, developed trainings on how to improve outcomes by partnering with youth and families. We also developed an amazing program with the Department of Probation, where it's the community-based. It's the parent support program. Every family court has a peer support program here in New York City. We were able to replicate and train folks in Ohio. They have parent navigators. DC Clinton had their parent engagement specialists. In Seattle, Washington, we have parent advisory. But what 2020 did was, when I took the lead of the national organization, I relocated Justice for Families in New York. And COVID helped me establish an office at headquarters. It used to be an old doctor's office. And out of that space, we were able to create programs, resources that can help families, help them also train them in advocating to become community peer navigators. we're not just fighting one system. How can we help families understand that there's various systems that are impacting us, and everyone plays a different role in tackling and fighting and abolishing these systems? But we can't get rid of anything until we strengthen communities, until we put in the resources that we need for families and young people, until our schools are also up to par. You know, we can't continue pushing kids from suspension to detention to incarceration. We need to invest in educating our kids in our public schools. But creating spaces, creating a blueprint, a one-stop shop where families can go for even respite. You know, we remove kids from home because, oh, you know, the kid need a break. The family may need a break. Let's create spaces where family can sit down, have a cup of tea, have a cup of coffee, learn techniques on how to breathe, being mindful of putting yourself in spaces that are healing. You know, we no longer can continue also dictating pharmaceutical agents to put all these toxic prescriptions and over prescribing. You know, we talked about Khalid Browder, but his mom was going through a lot, and also all these medications that the doctors were giving her. So how do we go back to even healing ourselves from the generational trauma without using systems? And we can't trust systems any longer. You know, though we partner and we know that there's folks with good intentions, but good intentions are no longer any good for our kids. We don't want to lose another generation. We need to continue building community and putting those resources in communities. And then let's get rid of these systems that we don't need.
Good intentions are
Because
not
there's
good for
data.
our kids. Yeah.
There's data that says
Yes.
they've not done a good job.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jeannette. Bringing us right to Chris Henning. Good intentions are no longer good for our kids, Chris Henning. Our advocates have the data. We've got the research. Can you give us a little advice?
Yeah, I want to put myself out of business. That's listening to this.
Yes,
right?
amen.
I want
Amen.
to put myself out of business, which means I want to, you know, as a lawyer who has access to these stories, right? All the stories that we've shared, and is educating folks really on the harms of separation at every phase of the juvenile legal system. Educating ourselves on the harms of the family policing system in ways that we as youth defenders and youth advocates honestly have not known. I think that's absolutely critical. And then once we are armed with that knowledge and we begin to educate folks, I think it is, Marianne, drawing from every tool in our toolbox, from individual advocacy to impact litigation, policy advocacy, media and community education, and data collection, which Jeannette just, you know, was throwing out at the end. It's all of the pieces. So when I think about individual case advocacy, it's about changing my interview protocol, right? For the questions that I ask of my client, my client's family members, their siblings. You know, how many of us as defenders talk to our client's siblings? We do when they're witnesses in the case, right? But are we asking those hard questions about the impact and the impact on the entire family? I had this beautiful, painful, but just beautiful moment when, you know, my client's mom got, you know, angry in court and stomped out of the courtroom, and, you know, she was crying, you know, hysterically. And my client's sister came up and pulled me aside because I was chasing after the mom, you know, trying to help her, trying to offer support, even just a hug. And my client's sibling said to me, "Let me just tell you a little bit about what's going on at home." And she just broke it down, like all of the different traumas that the family had been experiencing, and it was just powerful. And it helped me relate even better to mom than before. So all of that, changing the way I engage families. I think about detention advocacy and disposition advocacy front and back end, and the ways I'm going to use the research, all the research that Reba has been putting in the chat, that Dorothy collects in her book, Torn Apart. That stuff needs to go in our pleadings. It needs to go in our mitigation letters and our disposition letters and motions to reduce detention. All of that research should, amplify the arguments that we're already making. I think, in terms of impact litigation, partnering with local advocacy organizations, the ACLU, whomever is fighting and really providing our strategies and stories from on the ground. Policy advocacy, I already said putting myself out of business, but like advocating for a divestment, right? A divestment from the juvenile legal system and a reinvestment in children, families, and communities, just like Jeannette and Dorothy have been talking about. And then data tracking, like what does it look like, for our kids and sharing that data. So those are my aspirational objectives. And I Marian, we talk about this all the time, defenders are often on the front line. The people work in public defender offices and our caseloads are crushing and we feel like we can't do these things, right? But it's like some of what's happening in this conversation, who do we need to be in the room with to have the conversation to figure out who else can help drive the agenda? But often in many ways, we hold the stories, because Jeannette, you said something powerful about when parents speak up, which they should, and we have to empower, but they fear retaliation, right? So sometimes maybe I can be that voice if I am asked and invited into that space. So how can we partner? You don't have to do it alone, but how can I at least set aside people in my office and individual time and my load to have these conversations with folks, geniuses, experts like Dorothy Roberts and Jeannette, Bocanegra? That would make me happy.
Thank you so much, Henning. Okay, and now we're going to do our final wrap up. It might have to be 30 seconds from each of you. I really appreciated the vision each of you shared, a vision for what we're building towards every day in the work that each of you and all of us in this conversation are doing. What's your 30-second advice to this community? I'll start with Professor Roberts. Jeannette, Chris, have you closed out?
Okay, well, quick, since we only have 30 seconds, I'll just say one thing, which is organize to join collectively with people who are already building organizations, many of them led by system impacted parents and children. They know what needs to be done. And because this crosses so many different oppressive systems, there are lots of organizations that are addressing each one, and we need to have more of a collective effort.
Organize.
We can be stronger and implement these ideas. Organize, yes.
Thank you, Dorothy. You froze for a second.
I'm going to start with organize, support families. It does take a village to raise children. We cannot do it alone. We no longer can allow systems to disrupt the future of our young people. Every parent wants the best for their children. Again, we want them to thrive and be successful citizens in society. And if you don't care about our Black and brown kids and you don't care about the money that's being wasted, love has no boundaries and love has no colors. I have 3 brown, beautiful, handsome young men and 3 brown, beautiful young women, and you never know if they're going to knock on your door.
Beautiful. We can't let these systems disrupt our families. Jeannette, thank you. Chris, Henning.
Yeah, I'll just we should end with that one. I'll just summarize it to say, treat children like children, all children, every child, Black, brown, blue. Let children be children, not commodities, not objects to be feared, not objects to be weaponized, manipulated, used against, parents, and a source of income and money. Treat children like children when they're whatever system that they're in. Remember that they are children just being children.
Chris, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Jeannette. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Chris, so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us. We will send out a short survey. We hope all of you participating will join us. I hope you'll join us for our final chapter 12 on February 28th. And just to leave you with being non-reformist reformers, as Dorothy invites us to act like we can make revolution happen every day. What we do, we know this is a lot, but we're so grateful for all of you for everything that you do with young people and families every day. Thanks for joining.